August 15, 1945. Japan's empire had fallen. Yet in a remote bamboo hut in the Philippine countryside, the air still trembled with fear. A group of young women, once forced to serve as comfort girls, sat frozen in silence, waiting for whatever came next. For years they had learned that footsteps meant pain, that uniforms meant violation. They braced for cruelty once again. But what entered through the doorway that day was something they could never have imagined. American soldiers stepped inside, not with rifles raised or voices barking orders, but carrying food, soap, and even a harmonica. The women stared in disbelief. For the first time in years, no one reached for them. Why did this happen? And how did that single moment shift everything they thought they knew about war and humanity? Stay with me as we uncover one of World War II's most overlooked chapters. The final broadcast of Japan's emperor spread across the airwaves that same afternoon. The voice of Emperor Hirohito drifted through static, formal, and distant, declaring surrender in words so archaic that many listeners struggled to understand their meaning. In Tokyo, crowds broke apart, some weeping, some rioting. But hundreds of miles away on the island of Luzon, those words meant nothing to the women who still sat on woven mats, fanning the heavy tropical heat. For them, the war hadn't ended. Guards still patrolled. Doors still slammed shut. Each approaching footstep still froze their breath. For years, uniforms had meant ownership. Commands had meant submission. What surrounded them wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was a machine. Across Asia, a lattice of so-called comfort stations stretched from Burma to Shanghai. Tens of thousands of women, most deceived or kidnapped, were trapped inside that network. Historians estimate between 50,000 and 200,000 passed through its doors. Most were Korean, but many others were Chinese, Filipino, Indonesian, Taiwanese, and even Dutch. Ledgers recorded them like supplies, names, numbers, rotations. Some were sent to barracks outside Manila, others to makeshift shacks in the Burmese jungle. A Japanese army physician once described the system in cold, mechanical terms. Women inspected, cataloged, and rotated to maintain quotas. Survivors would later recall those humiliations in chilling detail, standing naked in lines for weekly checks, the scratching of pens marking tallies beside their bodies. One woman summed it up decades later. We weren't people. We were schedules. The sensory memories never faded. The bitter sting of disinfectant mixed with sweat. The clatter of metal mess tins outside bamboo walls. The faint curl of incense lit by someone trying to disguise fear's smell. At night, the jungle's hum of insects collided with the crunch of boots on gravel, each sound announcing another intrusion. Many women endured 15, 20, sometimes 30 men a day. Reports collected later by Allied medics confirmed those numbers. The emperor's calm surrender speech meant nothing against the pounding rhythm of that reality, yet even before surrender, cracks appeared. Supply lines faltered, rations thinned, and discipline eroded. Japanese soldiers, themselves starving, sometimes shared rice with the women, not out of compassion but exhaustion. In those final months, diaries hinted at disintegration. Guards too weary to enforce orders, women singing softly in the dark to remind themselves they were alive. A Korean survivor named Kim Hak-sun, who would one day speak publicly in 1991, remembered, "The soldiers were terrified of losing, but we had nowhere to run. We were trapped in their fear and in our own." Statistics painted the vastness. By the summer of 1945, the Japanese army had spread comfort stations across 10 occupied territories. Manila alone contained dozens, serving thousands of troops. Captured medical files later revealed over 70% of the women were severely malnourished. More than half carried venereal infections. Nearly all bore lasting scars inside and out. These numbers, buried for decades, revealed the true price of an empire's illusion of control. And then, abruptly, it ended. Orders from Tokyo no longer held weight. The guards who once ruled with impunity stood stunned, their radios hissing with static. Outside, the low rumble of Allied engines drew closer, the sound of diesel mingling with humid air. Inside, the women waited, braced between terror and hope. What kind of men would come next? Would the cycle repeat? The crunch of unfamiliar boots echoed on the gravel. Paper screens trembled. But instead of commands, they heard crates being set down, a harmonica's trembling note, the metallic snap of a tin opening. War had stopped. And the most astonishing thing for the women was not defeat, but the sudden absence of violation. Yet to understand that moment of paradoxical mercy, we must look back at how the machinery began. Japan's military didn't stumble into this system. It designed it deliberately. Its roots reached to the early 1930s. After the horrors of the Nanjing Massacre in 1937, where reports of mass assault appalled even friendly nations, Japan's high command sought to regulate its soldiers' impulses. Their solution wasn't to end abuse, but to institutionalize it. They called the facilities Ianjo, comfort stations. By 1941, as the Pacific War widened, these sites had become as routine as supply depots or field hospitals. Women were transported like freight. Korean teens were promised factory jobs, only to find themselves herded into trains bound south. Filipina girls were taken during village sweeps. In the Dutch East Indies, colonial families were shattered as daughters vanished into the system. By 1942, comfort stations stretched from Shanghai and Singapore to Burma and the Philippines, even to scattered Pacific islands. Fragments of ledgers that survived show quotas, rotations, and supposed payments, rarely reaching the women themselves. At the network's height, historians estimate roughly 400 stations operated at once, each with about 20 women. The arithmetic of exploitation was staggering. On paper, Japan proclaimed itself champion of Asia for Asians, vowing to liberate the region from Western imperialism. In practice, its armies consumed those same Asian women as expendable resources. The contradiction was glaring. One Chinese survivor put it simply, "They spoke of honor, but fed that honor with our bodies." Intelligence documents from 1944 supported the testimony. Captured Japanese files showed up to 90% of the enslaved women were Korean. Across all territories, even conservative estimates, 50,000 to 200,000, revealed a scale larger than many wartime cities. The destruction of records during Japan's retreat makes exact numbers impossible. Still, the fragments left behind tell enough. Columns of digits where human lives once stood. Their memories preserved what the ledgers erased. They remembered the choking odor of carbolic acid sprayed between visits, the taste of thin, watery rice, the rasp of rough blankets against raw skin, and the dreadful quiet after each night's ordeal. Those huts were prisons without locks, the bars made of geography and fear. Some women scratched marks into the bamboo walls to count days, others feigned illness, buying a few hours of rest at terrible risk. A 16-year-old in Burma tried to flee. She was captured and vanished. No one dared speak her name again. By 1945, shortages and disease ravaged what remained. Soap disappeared, medicine ran out, food dwindled. The system collapsed not from mercy, but starvation. Documents recovered in Manila show more than half the captives infected, 7 of 10 malnourished. The empire's machinery had begun to devour itself, and it was into this ruin that the Americans arrived, men carrying boxes, radios, and cigarettes, expecting combatants but finding only frightened women cataloged like property. What came next would shatter every rule these survivors had learned about power. Long before the surrender, their lives had been reduced to arithmetic. The Japanese bureaucracy transformed intimacy into data. Women, 14. Visits per day, 280. That equaled roughly 20 men for every woman, every day. When Allied medics later debriefed survivors, they heard similar numbers. 15 to 30 clients daily. Illness their only reprieve, though even sickness brought punishment. "We were not people, we were shifts," a Korean survivor said years later. The euphemism comfort was a mockery. The word had been emptied of its meaning. They spoke, too, of sensory details that never left them, the sting of antiseptic that burned their skin, the thin paper screens that never shut out eyes, the brush of coarse uniforms that meant the night was beginning again. A Dutch captive told investigators, "The sound of boots was worse than gunfire. It meant everything would start again." Inside those huts, fragments of humanity flickered. One Filipina woman quietly hummed Tagalog lullabies after soldiers left, reminding herself she had once belonged somewhere. A 17-year-old Korean girl carved a small bird into the bamboo frame of her mat, a dream of flight in a place where none could escape. Each small act was rebellion against erasure. The bureaucracy's cruelty extended even to procedure. Each woman was issued metal tokens, one for every soldier who came. Afterward, some received stamped receipts, grotesque mementos of control disguised as order. Japanese officers filed reports about efficiency, describing women rotated every 2 months to maintain morale. Such sanitized phrasing concealed screams behind clerical neatness. Calculations expose the magnitude. 400 stations multiplied by 20 women equaled 8,000 captives at any one time. Over years of transfers, that number climbed into tens of thousands. Some were only 12 years old. U.S. Army medical files later, uncovered in the Philippines, recorded venereal infection, rates above 50%, and evidence of forced abortions performed without anesthesia. Amid this brutal arithmetic, small paradoxes of survival emerged. A guard slipping a rice ball to a sick girl, not from kindness, but because disease reduced her use. A friend distracting a soldier so another could rest an hour. Even compassion became tactical. When Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radios on August 15th, the ledgers didn't close overnight. Guards, unsure of what surrender meant, continued their routines. The women obeyed, too afraid to question. The nights still carried the echo of boots, but hesitation lingered in each step. Then new sounds arrived, diesel engines, heavy and alien. American convoys moved toward Manila, bringing an unexpected kind of power, the power not to harm. For the women watching through bamboo slats, disbelief became its own terror. They prepared for the familiar, commands, inspections, the inevitable touch. Instead came the soft clank of crates, laughter in strange accents, and the metallic pop of a can being opened. One Korean woman later recalled, "They put food down, real food, and stepped away. We thought it was a trick." The soldiers offered soap, cigarettes, even music. A Filipina survivor tasted canned peaches for the first time and wept. The sweetness hurt her tongue. Uniforms still filled the doorway, yet none reached forward. Few words were shared, so gestures spoke. A bar of chocolate unwrapped, a cigarette lit and passed across with a hesitant smile, a harmonica note floating through the humid air. A Dutch captive remembered, "One man leaned his rifle against the wall and played music, and we knew he wouldn't touch us." That sound was freedom. For years, those huts had been cages without locks, places where discipline meant nightly violation. Now the same symbol of authority, a soldier's uniform, was transformed by restraint. Some women froze, certain violence would follow if they moved. Others couldn't believe the absence of hands. "We thought they were pretending," one said. But they never did what we feared. U.S. Army medical teams later recorded what they found in those huts, and the numbers were staggering. In Manila alone, reports noted that more than half of the liberated women suffered from venereal infections, and over 70% showed visible signs of malnutrition. Many were too weak to stand when the soldiers arrived. Doctors wrote that several weighed less than 80 pounds, their ribs showing like ribs of cages, their skin paper-thin from starvation. To the medics, these bodies were evidence of systematic exploitation. To the women, the first taste of canned peaches or condensed milk felt unreal, almost painful in its sweetness. "It was too sweet," one survivor whispered years later. "We had forgotten what sweetness even meant." Governments reacted unevenly. In 1993, Japan issued the Kono Statement, acknowledging that its military had helped establish and operate the Comfort Station network. But the words were cautious, wrapped in diplomatic hedging and careful phrasing. Later administrations would even back away from that acknowledgement. 2 years later, Japan launched the Asian Women's Fund, an effort to provide compensation through donations framed as atonement money. Many survivors refused it. They did not want charity. They demanded accountability. The pattern repeated itself: recognition without responsibility, apology without closure. As years passed, the debate hardened into a memory war. Nationalists in Japan dismissed survivor testimonies as exaggerations, while across South Korea and the Philippines, activists built memorials and held rallies demanding truth. In 2011, a bronze statue appeared outside the Japanese embassy in Seoul. A young girl seated in quiet defiance, her empty chair beside her inviting the world to listen. Every Wednesday since, citizens have gathered there to remember the women whose voices were ignored in 1946. For many survivors, memory was both liberation and burden. Speaking meant reopening wounds. Silence meant erasure. Some gave one testimony and vanished again into privacy. Others traveled the world, determined that their final years would not be spent unseen. "We are not just history," said Filipina survivor Lola Rosa in 1996. "We still live. We still breathe, and we want the world to know." Though the tribunals had ignored them, the survivors' voices reshaped global awareness. What had once been whispered in fear became spoken in classrooms and parliaments. The comfort women system, long buried under decades of denial, rose into the open as one of the defining human rights issues of the late 20th century. By century's end, what began as scattered testimonies became a movement inscribed in stone, bronze, and memory. Monuments rose in Seoul, Manila, San Francisco, and Berlin. Each portrayed the same symbol: a young woman sitting silently, her gaze unflinching, an empty chair beside her for the missing. These sculptures were not built for pity, but for remembrance. Yet every statue drew formal protests from Tokyo, whose officials insisted the matter was settled, the apologies sufficient, the records closed. This tension, the tug between remembrance and denial, became the paradox carried into the future. The women who had been silenced for half a century were finally heard, only to be doubted by those who refused their truth. Governments traded statements and treaties. Survivors simply wanted acknowledgement. The numbers mattered: 50,000, 100,000, 200,000. But what mattered more were names, faces, individual stories that refused to fade. Each testimony chipped away at the myth that the past could be buried. And in that slow unveiling, another contrast appeared: the difference between the armies that had occupied them. Many Americans who encountered survivors in 1945 remembered not conquest, but restraint. One Army doctor later wrote, "We'd been told the Japanese used these women like rations, disposable. To us, they were human beings in need of care. I couldn't touch them as they feared I would. That was my act of respect." His recollection mirrored the wider theme: mercy as defiance. Sometimes compassion itself can disrupt the machinery of war. From bamboo huts to tribunal courts, the story stretched across decades and continents. It began with trembling paper walls in the tropics, and ended with diplomatic cables exchanged in capital cities. The women, who had once flinched at the sound of boots, lived long enough to see their names engraved on memorial plaques. Their testimonies were archived, studied, and honored by strangers half a world away. They had entered history not as victims but as witnesses. They had been told that no one would remember. Yet decades later, students read their words. Artists sculpted their likenesses, and crowds bowed before their statues in cities they had never seen. In a war remembered for tanks and bombers, their endurance revealed another kind of strength. The most lasting weapon was not destruction, it was testimony. One historian summarized Japan's downfall with haunting simplicity. They came as conquerors but left as students, their empire dismantled, their myths undone. And the Americans, whose restraint so stunned the survivors, left behind not domination but a paradoxical memory that even in total war, restraint could be its own form of power. In the end, America's greatest weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance, the ability to offer soap instead of chains, peaches instead of orders, silence instead of command. For the women who had lived through the darkest machinery of the war, those small mercies were proof that even after years of systematic cruelty, humanity had not been extinguished. Their story is not a simple tale of villains and saviors. It is a record of paradox, of a system that reduced women to numbers, and of strangers who gave them back fragments of dignity. It is the chronicle of silence shattered too late, of memory contested by politics, and of survivors who demanded to be seen as more than history. Above all, it is a reminder that in even the harshest landscapes of war, the smallest acts of kindness, the sharing of food, the decision not to exploit, The recognition of a name can echo longer than the thunder of guns. The silence that followed Japan's surrender was almost unbearable. For the women who had lived as prisoners in their own bodies, liberation did not immediately bring peace. The guns had stopped, but the world outside their huts barely noticed them. Newspapers celebrated victory. Politicians redrew borders. Generals spoke of rebuilding nations. But no one spoke of the women hidden behind bamboo walls. Their pain didn't fit into the tidy story of triumph. For many, returning home was another kind of exile. In Korea, survivors found doors closed and families ashamed. In the Philippines, some changed their names or married quietly, choosing secrecy over humiliation. Shame became a wound that lingered long after the physical scars faded. "I came home," one woman said, "but there was no home for me." Decades rolled by in silence. The survivors grew older. Their stories became whispers told only in the dark, if at all. History's spotlight passed elsewhere, onto Cold War alliances, reconstruction, and prosperity. The world forgot that tens of thousands of women had been erased into statistics. Yet memory, however buried, has a way of resurfacing. By the late 20th century, a new generation of scholars and activists began to ask questions. Why were the comfort women never included in war crime indictments? Where were the archives, the testimonies, the ledgers that had once tracked them like inventory? Bit by bit, the truth reemerged. Declassified reports, diaries, and surviving documents revealed what had been hidden. And then in 1991, one voice broke the silence completely. Her name was Kim Hak-sun. At 73, she stood before cameras in Seoul and said words that had never before been spoken in public. "I was taken when I was 17. I was forced to serve soldiers." The world listened. Her courage cracked open a silence nearly 50 years thick. Within months, dozens of other women stepped forward. Koreans, Filipinas, Chinese, Indonesians, Dutch. They spoke of deceit, captivity, survival. Each testimony chipped away at decades of denial. The reaction was swift and divided. Many expressed sympathy, others disbelief. In Japan, the revelation sparked political storms. Some conservatives accused the women of lying. Others claimed the system had been voluntary. But truth has a stubborn gravity. As more documents surfaced, denial became harder to maintain. Historians traced military memos, supply records, and transport logs proving that the comfort stations had been state-organized and centrally managed. Under mounting pressure, the Japanese government issued the Kono Statement in 1993, an official acknowledgement that the army had been directly involved. It apologized for the suffering inflicted. Yet the apology was cautious, wrapped in language that left room for reinterpretation. Future leaders would revise or minimize it. The Asian Women's Fund, created soon after, attempted to offer compensation through private donations rather than state reparations. To the survivors, this distinction mattered. They rejected the money. "We do not want charity," one woman said. "We want justice." And so the paradox of recognition without responsibility began. The women were finally visible but still unheard. Governments spoke of closure, while the survivors carried open wounds. By the late 1990s, civic movements across Asia and beyond had transformed remembrance into resistance. Weekly vigils formed outside embassies. Documentaries and exhibitions gave faces to forgotten numbers. Scholars translated testimonies into dozens of languages. The world began to see not just victims, but witnesses who had defied oblivion. In Seoul, Manila, and even cities far from Asia, statues began to rise. Quiet, dignified figures of young girls sitting in silence. Bronze skin, empty chairs beside them, gazes fixed forward as if watching time itself. Each monument carried a message. The past is not finished until it is remembered. Tokyo protested each unveiling, calling the matter settled. But the statues kept appearing. One in San Francisco, another in Berlin, one outside a museum in Sydney. Their stillness became a language stronger than argument. For the survivors, every act of remembrance was both comfort and pain. Speaking meant reopening the past. Silence meant surrendering it. "When I tell my story," said one Filipina, "I bleed again, but at least now the world sees the wound." By the early 2000s, time was claiming the last witnesses. Many died before hearing the words they longed for, a full, unconditional apology. Yet they had changed history. They had forced governments to confront what had been buried and made the world remember that war's victims are not only those who die, but those who must keep living. Their struggle also reshaped how nations define justice. What began as a forgotten chapter of World War II became a global conversation about accountability, gender, and human rights. The Comfort Women story influenced international law, truth commissions, and memorial movements worldwide. But politics continued to twist memory. Some Japanese leaders publicly denied the system's coercive nature. In response, activists doubled their efforts, organizing global awareness campaigns. Schools introduced survivor stories into textbooks. Human rights groups archived oral histories before they were lost. Every retelling became an act of resistance against forgetting. The paradox persisted, official words of regret shadowed by quiet retractions. Yet the truth remained unshaken. The women's own words, recorded in courtrooms and classrooms, outlasted every denial. One historian called it the longest echo of World War II, a war that ended in 1945 but kept reverberating through memory, shame, and testimony. Through it all, one theme endured: the transformative power of restraint. What began in horror ended in an unexpected lesson about humanity. The American soldiers who entered those huts in 1945 did not see enemies. They saw people who needed care. Their silence, their refusal to exploit, their choice to step back rather than reach forward. These became gestures of redemption in a world exhausted by cruelty. Their restraint did not erase what had happened, but it offered a glimpse of what civilization could mean even amid ruins. The war had shown the extremes of destruction. Their actions revealed that mercy, too, can leave an indelible mark. Those small moments, the bar of soap, the can of peaches, the harmonica's tune, outlasted empires. They became proof that compassion could survive even when morality had been bombed to rubble. In the years that followed, remembrance spread farther than anyone could have imagined. From the streets of Seoul to the parks of San Francisco, from Manila to Berlin, monuments rose like quiet witnesses. Young women in bronze, their feet bare, their expressions calm yet unyielding. Next to them, an empty chair waited for the ones who never returned. These figures stood not as symbols of victimhood, but as sentinels of dignity reclaimed. Every unveiling sparked controversy. Japan's government protested each new memorial, claiming that the issue had already been resolved. Yet every protest only amplified the story's reach. The women who had once been silenced by fear now spoke through statues, through the generations that followed them, through the lessons written into history books and echoed across classrooms. For some nations, the debate remained diplomatic. For the survivors, it was personal. What they wanted was not money or treaties, it was acknowledgement. They wanted the world to say, plainly, that what had been done to them was wrong. Whether historians counted 50,000 or 200,000, numbers could never hold the full truth. What mattered were the individual lives hidden behind those statistics. The girls who once hummed songs in the dark. The women who remembered the scent of soap as a form of salvation. Even among the soldiers who liberated them, memories lingered. Decades later, one American Army doctor reflected in his journal, "We had been told that the Japanese used these women like supplies, consumed and discarded. When I saw them, thin and trembling, I couldn't bring myself to touch them. They expected violation. Instead, we gave them food and care. That was all the difference in the world." His entry captured the paradox that defined the story. Sometimes, mercy itself is an act of rebellion. From bamboo huts to marble memorials, from forgotten ledgers to digital archives, this history stretches across scales of time and emotion. It begins in whispers of fear and ends in the steady voice of remembrance. The women who once shrank from the sound of boots lived long enough to see their names carved into plaques, their testimonies preserved in libraries and classrooms. They had entered history not as footnotes, but as witnesses whose courage reshaped how nations remember war. They had been told that no one would care. Yet decades later, Their stories reached beyond borders, read by students, documented by journalists, honored by strangers who wept before their statues. In a world that often measures war by victories and losses, this story endures as a different kind of victory, the triumph of endurance, of truth spoken aloud after silence, of compassion that survived when cruelty seemed absolute. For centuries, wars have been remembered for the destruction they bring, but this one left behind something else, a lesson about the quiet power of restraint. The Japanese soldiers who came as conquerors left behind an empire in ruins, their myths shattered. And the Americans who arrived afterward, those who chose not to dominate but to show mercy, left behind a paradoxical legacy. That strength is not only measured in firepower, but in the ability to hold one's hand still. In the end, America's most powerful weapon was not its bombs, but its abundance, the capacity to give instead of take, to offer soap instead of chains, peaches instead of orders, silence instead of command. For the women who had endured the machinery of enslavement, these gestures meant more than any declaration or treaty. They were proof that even after years of systematic cruelty, humanity could still reappear in the simplest acts. The story of the comfort women and their encounter with American soldiers is not a tale of heroes and villains. It is a study of contradictions. It is about a system that reduced women to numbers and a moment when strangers helped restore fragments of their dignity. It is a story of silence broken too late, of truth weaponized by politics, and of survivors who refused to vanish quietly into history. Above all, it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest landscapes, the smallest acts, a gift of food, the refusal to exploit, the recognition of a name, can echo longer than the thunder of guns.